Any other questions? Thank you all so much for your presentation. Do we have any comments from anybody sign up to ask questions in reference to this, Mr. Tam? No? Okay.
Matthew?
Mr. Cardinale, did you sign up?
Hi, everybody. Matthew Cardinale, news editor of AtlantaProgressiveNews.com. Ms. Sheperd, 2 weeks ago, you said that you had just received the answers to my questions and to Ben Howard's questions, and that you had not had time to look at them yet, that you'd be looking at them and that they would somehow be addressed. So I was kind of wondering when that was going to happen. Would that be today, or?
No, I have looked at those questions. We're satisfied. The committee is satisfied with the answers to those questions. We have no other comments in reference to those questions.
Okay.
And you got your answers from via the questions, and so we're satisfied with that.
Okay. Okay. Well, you shouldn't be satisfied with those answers, and that's what I'll be talking about. Before I get into that, I do have a question for you, Ms. Sheperd. Now, I learned that you are on the board of directors of Beltline, Inc. And I would like to know if you could explain to me and the public by what authority you are on that board. I can't locate any kind of resolution appointing you to the board. Somebody told me that according to the Beltline bylaws that the chair of CDHR would always be on the board, but that would be their bylaws, not any city policy. So I'm wondering, how is it, by what authority, and then how are we benefiting from this? Are we benefiting from this in any way? Are you bringing information back to us? And how is this not a conflict of interest? I mean, particularly right now, and I'm going to get into the lack of response that I've gotten from the Beltline and the unacceptable response from the Beltline. And I'm just wondering, you know, is it really you serving on the board of directors of the Beltline that creates a conflict that, you know, you want them to be successful, and therefore that's why we're not getting the oversight here that's needed? So if you could address those questions.
Mr. Cardinale, I sit on several boards because I am, by virtue of the fact that I'm chair of community development and human resource. I sit on the board by virtue of that being chair of that. I sit on the Beltline. I sit on the board of ADA. I sit on the Civil Rights Human Commission board. I serve on several boards by the fact that I am chair of that committee. So that is a law that is via the city, not something that, and it's not a conflict of interest as a matter of fact. It's not a conflict of interest. I'm appointed based on that. Now, we don't have a lawyer here in the room today, but that is the fact. No, I'm not going to get a lawyer. I'm just telling you the facts. I'm sorry. And what was your other question, Mr. Cardinale?
Well, how are we benefiting from you being on the board in any way, and why is it not a conflict of interest? Because it would just seem to me that, you know, you're on this board. So you're a part of the Beltline, but you're also in charge of the committee that's overseeing.
The reason it's not a conflict of interest in terms of the authority, these are authorities. The Beltline is an authority. The Land Development Authority is an authority that actually does things for the city. By me sitting on there, I'm representing the city portion of that, along with the mayor and myself. So in terms of legislative, I sit as the legislative branch. The mayor sits in terms of him being executive of the city of Atlanta. So we both sit on those authorities.
Right.
And so that in terms of a conflict of interest and how we're benefiting, I continuously have meetings in terms of making sure there's input in the community. I'm out in the community on a regular basis. I listen, I hear. As a matter of fact, Mr. Cardinale, even in terms of the fact of the questions you asked, I've made sure that they were brought to the Beltline. So what I do in terms of that, as a chair of this committee, I continuously make sure that we are represented in terms of from a legislative perspective and also a community perspective. So that's what I do.
Okay. Well, so let me go through the history again of what happened here. So in June, Mr. Leary was here. I asked the question about why the Beltline and ADA opposed the requirement for units affordable to families at 30% AMA in the original requirements. He said he didn't have the answer, that someone would be back in September. That didn't happen. You did, to your credit, ask them to come back in November. They still didn't address the question. So then you asked me to put it, we were asking for them to address the question right then, which is when they were supposed to, You said, well, we don't have time for that. Can you put your questions in writing, Mr. Howard, as well? We did that. Now they're coming back with the questions. We have follow-ups. Well, not really follow-ups. We have concerns about these answers. And so I'm just troubled about that. Now, they have not even answered at all, except for a comment on my blog. But I have already given you all the documentation that they deceived or attempted to deceive me and attempted to deceive this committee, because it was the original BAHAB recommendation, and I passed that out to you. Now, they posted a comment on the blog that, oh no, we were referring to the original would be this meeting that BAHAB had, and look at the minutes, and this is what they were preparing to do. That's not what they did. That's not a recommendation that they issued. The recommendation that was issued is the one that was issued to BAHAB and the ADA as part of the process. So I stand by that, and they should have to answer that. There's more issues of deception than that. The fact is, these questions, they only responded to the ones that were convenient to them. Okay? Mr. Young, you want to talk about affordable housing in this city? I'm right here. The conversation is going on. And I'm just shocked that you would have no follow-up to my question, since this is what we're talking about. What is affordable? We can talk about affordable, but what is the target? What is the AMI? And then how is affordability defined? This is it. We're talking about mixed income housing. This is it. And y'all don't even want to have the conversation, apparently. Okay? And I just feel that they're playing games. This is not the kind of game playing that should be allowed in a council committee. Even if they thought that it was not the original recommendation, if they wanted to call it recommendation 1A or 1B or whatever, they could have said that was not the original recommendation, but we did oppose the recommendation that was issued to us the following month, and here's why. Because they know that I've asked this question 4 times. This is the 5th time that they're here, and they still haven't answered. Why won't they answer? Is it because they're ashamed of what they did? I just can't fathom that this committee is going to sit here and allow this. You're going to say that they're satisfied? I mean, and that's again why I'm bringing up the possible conflict of interest with the person who's chairing the committee that's supposed to oversee the Beltline sitting on the Beltline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cardinale. And again, in terms of me sitting on this board and on the committees, I am doing it representing the city and chairing this committee. There is no conflict of interest. If you believe that, that is your belief. Mr. Cardinale, I will say to you again is that we have answered all questions in reference to that, to this issue. I know this is your opinion, that you're not satisfied with that. That happens. We went back and looked at documentations. I've got with the Beltline and looked at everything that you asked. And BAHAB concurred with the findings. The authority concurred. The city actually voted through the legislation based on those findings. And so at this point, we're through with those issues in terms of that. Thank you. Ms. Archibald.
Just to clear the air, and I do see we have someone from the law department here, can you speak to the question that was posed relative to the need for legislation, or is it an automatic entitlement that a chair of CDHR has to participate in several boards?
Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Denius. I'm an attorney with the law department. If I understand correctly, the question was whether or not additional action by the city would be needed to have the chair of CDHR committee serve on the board of directors of the Beltline. Is that correct?
Right.
Well, sort of.
Right. He's asking the question, how do I have the authority, the right to sit on the board, and why am I sitting on the board?
My understanding is that the chair of the CDHR committee is an ex officio member of the board of directors of the Beltline committee. That would be delineated in the establishing legislation and also reiterated in the bylaws of the Beltline.
What does ex officio mean?
Ex officio means that you hold an office by virtue, you hold a position by virtue of another office that you hold. So generally ex officio members are non-voting members. I don't know if that's the case in this particular situation. Not okay. So in this particular, it's not always, but a lot of times ex officio members do not vote. It doesn't mean that they can't, but ex officio simply means that you hold a position by virtue of an elected office. So if Ms. Sheperd ceased to be the chair of the CDHR committee, the subsequent chair of the CDHR committee would serve on the board of directors of the Beltline.
And a point of clarity, this just didn't happen by me being there. Before I was chair, the previous chair, Mr. Maddox, was on it, and before that, whoever was the chair before that has been on it from the inception of the Beltline and Atlanta Development Authority for years.
Right, and generally speaking, an ex officio member is put on in a situation like this on a board of directors in order to represent the interests of the entity in which they hold office. So in this particular situation, Ms. Sheperd, as chair of the CDHR committee, is representing the interests of the city of Atlanta and the council as a board member for the Beltline.
I have a follow-up question. First of all, I commend you for listening to all of the boards that you sit on. God bless you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Because if this was city utilities, I don't know. Okay. Anyway, the voting piece, though, more for you and maybe for the Beltline people, I think with the burden of having to come back for us to vote on things, I'd rather be a non-voting member. I'd be, so when did the voting part, is that something that we routinely have done? It's not a knock on it, it's just a question, trying to think through.
And I don't know. I would have to, again, get an opinion from the law department on that.
Right. Each sponsor of the TAD, the Beltline TAD, has an ex officio member representing the interests of that TAD sponsor on the Beltline board to represent the interests of, presumably, of those parties who are participating in the TAD. So that's why probably in this case it's a voting position.
But in the law, apparently what you said was it's not defined. It's defined by the organization.
Correct. Correct. There's no requirement that an ex officio member not be a voting member.
I got you. All right, thank you.
Mr. Young.
Saying this not to have a repartee with Mr. Cardinale, he's certainly entitled to his opinion, and actually the opinions that are brought before this committee are valued, whether we agree with them or not. But for me personally, recommendations are exactly what they are, recommendations. They're not fact, they're not law, they don't govern us, but they do help influence and drive policy. And far too often in the realm of affordable housing and so-called economic development, it has been my experience that this city has flawed and failed tremendously in creating a by census tract, every census tract, regardless of whether it's public or private. If it's public dollars being spent, it is my opinion that we ought to be more thoughtful in terms of the benefit, in terms of increased household incomes within a demographic, so that the lowest income households of a demographic might somehow benefit, not at their expense, not at their exclusion, but as a part of the revitalization. And so what that results in, my statement previously, is it is my strong belief that we cannot do economic development on the backs of poverty. But what we absolutely are obligated to do is to make some provision for the whole demographic, the lowest income households and beyond. And to that end, there has to be a sweet spot in there that enables us to still maintain some meaningful economic development, as we have not been able to in many of the challenged neighborhoods that I represent, because we are far too heavily inundated by poverty. Banks are not financing or investing, and in many of the census tracts that I represent, because we've not improved our demographic. So would I hamstring the Beltline effort to do affordable housing by mandating exorbitantly high percentages of poverty housing, or would I give them the benefit of studying the market and really understanding what would work best for our lowest income households as well as moderate and upper income households, and achieve a balance? I'd rather a more scientific approach where we minimize the impact on these existing neighborhoods and give them the benefit of opportunity. Rich, poor, it doesn't matter. They all want grocery stores. They all, but we allow a Publix to easily leave, with the notion that you don't have a demographic strong enough to support what we sell. Well, Walmart coming into our community proves them wrong. But at the same time, we have an obligation to deal with the whole demographic. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else?
Can I ask for a clarification since the law department's here on question?
No, sir.
May I ask the law department a question, Madam Chair?
Your time, you have
Thank
time.
you very much. And this problem, I'm going to start off with and use my time to address the public. And I thank you folks for watching. I thank you for challenging me and challenging them and watching us challenge them. This city is divided into 3 branches, right? Executive, legislative, and judicial. These folks represent the legislative branch, the folks who make the laws, the folks who create the ordinances. They just asked an attorney to come down here and clarify a situation. The attorney made some comments, and during the course of the comments, the attorney referenced the establishing legislation. That was the attorney's words. Not one of these people, these experts in legislation, these representatives of the folks who create legislation for you, ask the attorney to give them the ordinance number. And then you wonder why we, the public, have to come down here? Now let the attorney step forth and give you the ordinance number, that establishing legislation that says this, the chairperson of CDH, I don't care if Mr. Maddox, we had our problems with Mr. Maddox too. Bringing up Mr. Maddox is no credential. We need to know by what law, you use the word law, what law do you sit on that committee, and are the minutes being brought here to this committee? So let's just start with the answer to that question. Ordinance number is probably going to be 07-0-4 digits. What is that?
I don't have that number at this point, Mr. Howard, and we will bring that to the next meeting. We don't have those answers today.
It doesn't exist.
Mr. Howard, you're out of order at this point.
Madam Chair.
Ms. Moore, would you like to speak?
I sure would. I was listening in my office, and I decided to come out as Chair Committee on Council to just advise a little bit. And first of all, if anyone has an issue regarding potential, perceived, or otherwise conflicts of interest, the answers to those questions are best answered and asked of the ethics office. I mean, the law department really does not rule on ethics, and neither do we. So if anybody feels that there's a conflict, they should ask the ethics office. As it relates to, and I used to be CDHR chair, and I was on ADA and all the CIDs.
What year was that, Ms. Moore?
That was my first year in office, 1998. For the first 4 years of my first term, I was chair of CDHR every year. And I sat on that board every year. I sat on all of the Buckhead, the Midtown, the Downtown CID, and whoever else knows what else, because there's several, the Conservancy, there's several other boards that you sit on. It is a routine thing that a council member in a chair's position may have to sit on things. We have council members who have to sit on CIDs as a virtue of its being in their districts. The mayor sits on things as virtue of being the council member. So there is no conflict, and if they need to verify that, call the ethics office with a council member who is a chair sitting on a respective board, because by code or resolution or some enabling legislation, it requires that you do so. Now, if you're on that board and there's something personal and private that is a conflict, then you would do as you would do here at the City Hall, and that is recuse yourself for that particular issue. So I just wanted to clear that up. There is no conflict. As a matter of fact, if you all remember on Committee on Council, we just dealt with this issue the latter part of last year, when we were advised that if you sit on a community board, so say for instance I sit on the Agape Community Center board, that is considered by the ethics office as being a personal appointment. That's something, even though they like me on there because I'm a council member, that's a personal thing. And so it would be a conflict if Agape had something that came before the city, that I sat on that board with a fiduciary responsibility and pushed and advocated and voted on it. So in those instances, the ethics office has advised us, if it's a personal appointment on a board that you're on, that you would either be a non-voting member on that particular board, or you would recuse yourself if an issue from that board comes before the city. And she also specifically stated that that does not in any way hamper a council member who legislatively or otherwise is supposed to sit on a board from being able to a voting member. So you are a voting member of ADA representing the councils as that the mayor represents the city as a whole. You have Commissioner Darnell, who represents Fulton County. You have LaShondra LaBerks, who represents the school board, because all of these governmental entities need to be represented because our monies are the monies that are being used in these projects. So I just wanted to clear that up. And if anybody needs more clarity, I would suggest you refer them to the ethics officer, and she can clear it up better.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. We're going to move on at this point. Thank you. Thank you again, Beltline, for coming. We appreciate it.
Madam President, Ben Howard, Senior Advocate. Before the Beltline departs, could I get some clarity on my questions? Actually, I have not received the answers to my questions, and I did not request receipt of the answers to my questions. My questions were presented to this committee so that this committee, in behalf of the populace, the residents of this city, could get the responses to those questions. Now, apparently they responded to those questions, but you're saying that you don't want the public to hear the responses? Am I clear on that?
Mr. Howard, we're not going to. Your questions, all your questions, you have a right to them. We've responded. This committee is satisfied with what we've done.
I heard that, but I'm just asking you, is it okay if you divulge to the public the secret that you're harboring?
There's no secret, Mr. Howard. You asked those questions. You as an individual asked those questions.
But you took
we
it
answered those questions.
But you took it as the committee's responsibility, did you not?
I took it as a responsibility to get your questions answered.
Yes, ma'am.
And your questions were answered. Is that correct?
Okay, so
Is that correct that your questions were answered?
I think so. I'm taking your
Okay,
word for it because I
Thank you, Mr. Howard.
I don't have the answer.
I'm finished with that.
And that means I am too?
Well, go ahead and talk.
Madam Chair, can we get to the orders of the day? That's what I had raised my hand
All right.
for earlier.
Is there a
to
motion for us to move on?
I make that a motion.
Thank you.
So what does that mean for me?
He already had.
He has his answer.
He already had.
He has his answer.
Who's saying that I have the answers? Could they get to the microphone and make a public declaration?
Madam Chair, I've made a motion
That
that we move to the orders of the day. We have indulged the public for quite some time in regard.
I haven't
to
had 5
questions.
minutes yet.
And if there are answers in writing, if you'll please get those to Mr. Howard. And that's the motion that I'm making, that we get back to the orders of the day.
The motion is to move on, provide Mr. Howard with the answer, with the questions, the answer.
And what about my time? Thank you. My 5 minutes. Yeah, I'll take it. Thank you very much. I have 2 minutes and 14 seconds.
Now, Mr. Howard, if you want to read those answers for 2 minutes and 14 seconds, you
That
have
would
the
be
right
fine.
to do that.
Okay. No, well, unfortunately, members of the public, I need to use my 2 minutes and 14 seconds to dispel some other slanderous remarks that were made. There was a comment that made a distinction between Section 8 housing and quality housing. And there was a comment that was made making the distinction between affordable housing and poverty housing. I cannot go back home and let that statement stand, because I live in a wonderful affordable housing complex. And I dare anybody to come and meet me on the streets. I don't like duking it out. But if you're going to call the place I live poverty housing, we're going to have to tussle. As gray as my hair is, we're going to have to tussle. And out of respect, I'm not doing any tussling here except verbal tussling. Don't you dare ever, in my presence, talk about Section 8 housing or affordable housing or senior citizen housing as poverty housing. And I yield back the rest of my time.
can we get back
Thank
to the
you.
orders
We are
of the day?
now, we are, Ms. Winslow,